1931. The world is collapsing into chaos. The Great Depression has shattered the global economy. International trade has fallen by nearly 2/3. Banks are failing. Businesses are collapsing. Millions are unemployed. Across the world, entire nations are struggling to survive. In the United States, the world's largest economy, President Herbert Hoover searches desperately for answers as poverty spreads across America. Great Britain, ruler of the largest empire on earth, faces financial panic and political instability. France, master of the second largest empire, appears slightly more secure, but economic disaster is slowly approaching there as well. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, isolated from much of the world economy, remains largely protected from the worst effects of the Depression. Under Joseph Stalin, the USSR pushes forward with its first massive 5-year plan, an ambitious project designed to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower. In Asia, China avoids a full impact of the Depression, but faces horrors of its own. That same year, catastrophic floods devastate central China, killing an estimated 2 million people. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government is locked in a brutal civil war against communist rebels. Within just 10 years, these 5 nations, the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, will become the major allied powers in the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. But in 1931, almost nobody can see the catastrophe coming. And before we continue, if you enjoy deep historical documentaries, forgotten war stories, and cinematic retellings of history's darkest moments, make sure to subscribe now and join us on this journey through the events that change the world forever. Because what happens next will reshape human history. At the same moment these global crises unfold, 3 other nations begin moving toward a dangerous destiny: Germany, Italy, and Japan. Germany, humiliated by defeat in World War I, is now a weak democratic republic drowning in economic collapse. No country suffers more from the Great Depression than Germany. Its economy depended heavily on American loans that suddenly disappear overnight. Banks fail, factories close, businesses collapse, unemployment rises to 24%, and soon will climb to nearly 40%. In July, President Hoover temporarily suspends Germany's war reparations, the crushing payments imposed after World War I. But for ordinary Germans, the damage is already done. Desperation pushes millions toward political extremism. Support for both communists and ultranationalists grows rapidly. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini has already transformed the country into a fascist dictatorship. Since taking power in 1922, Mussolini has ruled Italy through fear, propaganda, and violence. The Depression strikes Italy hard as well, though massive state intervention softens some of the blow. And in East Asia, the Empire of Japan, unlike Germany, Japan escapes the worst of the economic collapse. But beneath the surface, something dangerous is growing: extreme nationalism, militarism, and a belief that Japan deserves a vast empire of its own. Within less than a decade, Germany, Italy, and Japan will unite into a military alliance history remembers as the Axis powers. Despite their differences, these nations share something important. Germany unified only in 1870, Italy in 1861. Japan reinvented itself during the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Historically speaking, all 3 are young powers, and all believe they were denied what older empires already possess: territory, resources, and empire. To many nationalists in these countries, empire means strength, empire means wealth, empire means survival. And during the unstable 1930s, a decade of economic disaster and collapsing international cooperation, these nations see an opportunity to erase past humiliations, expand by force, and seize what they believe should belong to them. It is a path that will place Germany, Italy, and Japan on a collision course with the established world powers, with catastrophic consequences for humanity. The first great crisis arrives in Manchuria, northeastern China. For years, Japan has expanded its influence inside China. Large Japanese military forces are already stationed in the region, especially the powerful Guangdong Army. But now, radical nationalist officers decide to take matters into their own hands. In September 1931, Japanese officers secretly blow up part of a Japanese-owned railway line near Mukden. The attack is staged by the Japanese themselves, a false flag operation. History remembers it as the Mukden Incident. Using the explosion as an excuse, Japan launches a full invasion of Manchuria. Chinese forces are completely unprepared. Many are poorly equipped, and Chiang Kai-shek remains more focused on destroying communist enemies in southern China. Within only 3 months, Japanese troops conquer nearly all of Manchuria and transform it into a puppet state called Manchukuo. Inside Japan, the public erupts with celebration. The country is swept by war fever. But across the West, outrage spreads rapidly. Japan's invasion directly violates the Kellogg-Briand Pact, an international treaty signed only 3 years earlier, in which nations promised to renounce war as a tool of policy. The League of Nations, supposedly responsible for protecting world peace, urgently meets in Geneva, but the League proves powerless. Japan itself is one of the League's most important members. Instead of taking military action, the League merely sends investigators. The message to aggressive powers is becoming clear. The international community will protest, but it will not fight, and the world is watching. 1932 begins with another brutal victory, this time for fascist Italy in Libya. After a 10-year campaign of repression, General Pietro Badoglio declares local resistance crushed. Italian forces use concentration camps, executions, and chemical weapons against Libyan civilians. For Mussolini, the success confirms his dream of building a new Roman Empire. Meanwhile, in Europe, diplomats desperately try to preserve peace. The 1925 Locarno Pact had created hopes that another European war could be avoided forever. In Geneva, world leaders gather for a massive disarmament conference attended by 61 nations. In June, Germany's reparations are reduced by 90% at the Lausanne Conference. For a brief moment, peace still seems possible, but it is only an illusion, because in Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are rapidly gaining power, and Hitler's hatred of the post-war order is no secret. At the same time, Joseph Stalin pushes the Soviet Union through massive industrial expansion. Factories multiply, steel and coal production explode, tank and aircraft production rise dramatically, but the human cost is horrifying. Forced collectivization destroys agriculture and triggers one of the deadliest famines in modern history. Between 6 and 9 million people die. In Ukraine, the catastrophe becomes known as the Holodomor. Soviet authorities attempt to hide the truth from the world. Elsewhere, political extremism continues spreading. In Spain, fierce battles erupt between reformers and conservatives. In Portugal, Antonio Salazar establishes the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. In Iraq, the country gains independence from Britain and joins the League of Nations. And in Japan, democracy itself begins collapsing under extremist violence. Nationalist officers assassinate Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi in 1932. The military's influence over Japanese politics grows stronger by the day. Meanwhile, in America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins the presidency, promising desperate citizens a New Deal. This nation asks for action, Roosevelt declares, and action now. But while Roosevelt fights economic collapse, Germany descends into political chaos. The Reichstag is paralyzed by conflict between Nazis, communists, and social democrats. In January 1933, President Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many believe experienced conservatives will control him. They are catastrophically wrong. Hitler, an Austrian-born World War I veteran, had transformed a small extremist movement into one of the most dangerous political forces in Europe. The Nazi ideology combines fanatical nationalism, hatred of the Versailles Treaty, violent anti-communism, and vicious anti-Semitism. Jews are blamed for Germany's defeat, humiliation, and suffering. Hitler openly called for German expansion eastward to seize living space. Much of this vision is already written clearly in his manifesto, Mein Kampf, but too few take it seriously. As Germany's economic crisis worsens, millions of desperate citizens turn toward Hitler's promises of national rebirth. Then, in February 1933, disaster strikes. The Reichstag building burns. A Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, is arrested at the scene. Though he acted alone, the Nazis claim the fire as part of a communist revolution. Hitler immediately suspends civil liberties. Political opponents are arrested. Newspapers shut down. Fear spreads across Germany. In March, new elections take place under Nazi intimidation and violence. The Nazis gain effective control of parliament. Soon after, the Enabling Act grants Hitler dictatorial powers. Germany's democracy is dead. Jewish businesses are boycotted. Concentration camps open at Dachau and Oranienburg. Opposition parties are banned. Germany becomes a one-party dictatorship. And Hitler's next target is the Versailles Treaty itself. Secret rearmament accelerates rapidly. Illegal aircraft factories produce planes at astonishing speed. At the Geneva Disarmament Conference, Germany demands military equality with France. When rejected, Hitler withdraws Germany from both the conference and the League of Nations entirely. It is another devastating blow to international peace. Japan had already abandoned the League earlier that same year. The system designed to prevent another world war is collapsing before everyone's eyes. Some foreign leaders begin to understand the danger. In Britain, Winston Churchill warns of Germany's growing militarism and dictatorship, but most people desperately want peace. The trauma of World War I still haunts Europe. Britain and France slash military spending while hoping compromise can avoid conflict. In America, isolationism dominates public opinion. Few are willing to fight another overseas war. Meanwhile, Hitler tightens his grip on Germany. In 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he orders the murder of rival Nazi leaders inside the SA paramilitary organization. The German army supports the purge. Its loyalty now belongs to Hitler. That same year, Austrian Nazis attempt a coup and assassinate Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. The goal is Anschluss, unification between Austria and Germany. But Benito Mussolini unexpectedly blocks Hitler's ambitions. Italian troops move toward the Austrian border, forcing Hitler to back down. Germany is not yet strong enough for confrontation, but it soon will be. In August 1934, President Hindenburg dies. Hitler abolishes the presidency entirely. Now he becomes Führer, absolute ruler of Germany. Every soldier and civil servant must swear personal loyalty directly to him. Europe watches nervously as Germany rearms at alarming speed. By late 1934, the German army has already tripled the size allowed under the Versailles Treaty. And across the world, another dangerous signal appears. Japan announces it will no longer obey the Washington Naval Treaty, which had limited naval expansion among the major powers. The age of disarmament is ending. The age of rearmament has begun, and the road toward World War II is now becoming impossible to stop. Music. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more cinematic history videos covering World War II, forgotten empires, military strategy, and the events that shaped our world, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because history is not just about the past. It explains the world we live in today. Steel production rises. Tank and aircraft manufacturing continues growing rapidly. The Soviet state demands enormous sacrifices from its people and race to industrialize. Workers are encouraged to emulate labor heroes, such as Alexei Stakhanov, celebrated for mining over 100 tons of coal in a single shift. But Stalin trusts no one. He fears threats from Nazi Germany, capitalist Europe, and Imperial Japan alike. Still, France now seeks cooperation with the Soviet Union. In February, Paris ratifies a treaty of mutual assistance with Moscow. The agreement is intended to deter Germany by threatening Hitler with war on two fronts. In reality, the treaty lacks serious military coordination, but Hitler immediately uses it as justification for his next gamble. Encouraged by the weak reaction to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, Hitler orders German troops into the Rhineland. The region is German territory, but under the Versailles Treaty and the Locarno Pact, it must remain demilitarized. No German troops, no fortifications. The Rhineland serves as a buffer protecting France. Now, Hitler violates both treaties openly. Europe faces another major crisis. Yet once again, Britain and France hesitate. Neither nation is ready for war. Public opinion strongly favors peace. Many British politicians dismiss Hitler's action as simply Germans walking into their own backyard. But behind the scenes, Hitler and his generals are terrified. The German army remains weak. If France had intervened militarily, German forces would have been forced to retreat immediately. But France does nothing, Britain does nothing, and Hitler wins. His popularity inside Germany soars. Meanwhile, Britain and France appear weak and indecisive once again. Far away in Africa, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia finally reaches its climax. Despite Ethiopia's fierce resistance, Italian forces possess overwhelming technological superiority. Aircraft, tanks, artillery, and chemical weapons devastate Ethiopian defenses. In March, Italian forces win a decisive battle at Mechu. Ethiopian resistance collapses. 5 weeks later, Italian troops enter Addis Ababa. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy is proclaimed Emperor of Ethiopia. Italy combines Ethiopia with its other East African colonies to create Italian East Africa. Emperor Haile Selassie escapes into exile. In May, he appears before the League of Nations in Geneva. His speech is passionate and emotional. He condemns Italy's use of chemical weapons and warns the world about the dangers of unchecked aggression. God and history will remember your judgment, he declares. But the League refuses meaningful action. Within months, sanctions against Italy are removed entirely. The lesson for dictators is becoming unmistakable. Aggression works. In Japan, extremist nationalism continues destabilizing the government. During the February 26th incident, radical army officers attempt another coup. Several political leaders are assassinated. Although the coup ultimately fails, militarists gain even greater influence within Japan. Meanwhile, Japanese expansion in China continues. Blocked from advancing south beyond the Great Wall, Japan instead pushes westward into Inner Mongolia, establishing another puppet regime known as Menjiang. An attempt to seize Suiyuan province fails after Chinese resistance. Inside China, anger grows against Chiang Kai-shek's reluctance to confront Japan directly. Then, in Xi'an, Chiang is dramatically kidnapped by one of his own generals. General Zhang forces him to agree to a truce with the communists. China's civil war temporarily pauses. Nationalists and communists unite in a fragile alliance against Japanese aggression. The Second United Front is born. Across Europe, economic hardship continues driving political extremism. In France, a left-wing Popular Front government wins elections under socialist leader Léon Blum. Many conservatives hate him so intensely that some openly declare, "Better Hitler than Blum." But nowhere does political division explode more violently than in Spain. There, another Popular Front government takes power. Spanish nationalists view the new administration as a mortal threat. In July 1936, military officers launch a coup. They seize Morocco, the Canary Islands, and parts of southern Spain. But the Republican government retains control over major cities. Spain descends into civil war. General Francisco Franco emerges as leader of the nationalists and soon declares himself head of state. Officially, foreign powers agree not to intervene. In reality, they quickly do. The Soviet Union sends weapons and advisors to support the Republicans. Mussolini dispatches troops, aircraft, and black-shirt militias to aid Franco. Hitler sends a Condor Legion, elite German air units that will later gain deadly experience for future wars. Gradually, the balance begins shifting in Franco's favor. In August 1936, Berlin hosts the Summer Olympics. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels transforms the Games into a spectacular showcase for Hitler's Germany. Foreign visitors are dazzled by displays of order, strength, and modernity. Anti-Semitic propaganda is temporarily toned down for international audiences. Many foreign guests leave impressed. Germany appears stable, prosperous, disciplined. Hitler presents himself as a man of peace who restored German pride and ended political chaos. In Britain, some influential figures even admire aspects of the Nazi regime. Among them is King Edward VIII. Yet behind the scenes, Hitler prepares for something entirely different. That same year, he secretly orders the creation of a 4-year plan. Its purpose is not peace, but war. Hitler believes Germany faces an inevitable racial struggle against what he calls Judeo-Bolshevism, centered in the Soviet Union. Germany must expand eastward, conquer territory, and secure living space. Otherwise, Hitler claims, the German people themselves will be destroyed. Under Hermann Göring, Germany begins rapidly preparing its economy for total war. Coal production expands. Iron and steel industries grow. 1935. Adolf Hitler now rules Germany with almost unlimited power. His hatred for the Treaty of Versailles, the agreement that ended World War I, is no secret. But how far he is willing to go to destroy the existing international order remains uncertain. The year begins with a major propaganda victory for Nazi Germany in the Saarland. This industrial, coal-rich territory had remained under League of Nations administration since the end of the war. But now, after a public referendum, the people vote overwhelmingly to return to Germany. For Hitler, it is a symbolic triumph. In March, Hermann Göring, head of German aviation, officially announces what much of Europe already suspects. Germany is rebuilding its air force. The creation of the Luftwaffe is a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. Only 2 weeks later, Hitler tears up the treaty once again by announcing the return of compulsory military service. Germany will now build an army of 36 divisions, more than 500,000 men. 3 months later, the Kriegsmarine launches a new submarine, another clear breach of post-war restrictions. Until now, Britain has attempted to manage Hitler through diplomacy. British leaders hoped that limited concessions might convince Germany to moderate its rearmament and perhaps even rejoin the League of Nations. But in both London and Paris, concern is rapidly growing. How dangerous are Hitler's ambitions? Can Germany's demands be peacefully accommodated through negotiation, or will Europe eventually need military force to stop him? This question begins dividing politicians in Britain and France between those favoring compromise and those demanding a stronger response. Most leaders, however, try to balance diplomacy with deterrence, but any strategy depends on unity among Germany's neighbors. And so, in April 1935, Britain, France, and Italy meet in the Italian resort town of Stresa. Together, they condemn Germany's treaty violations and pledge to defend Europe's borders, especially Austria, which Hitler openly desires to absorb into Germany. The Stresa Front appears to offer a united European stand against Nazi aggression, but the alliance quickly begins to unravel. Only 2 months later, Britain signs its own naval agreement with Germany, without consulting France or Italy. The agreement allows Germany to expand its navy to 35% of the size of the Royal Navy. For France and Italy, the move feels like betrayal. Yet British naval planners fear something even worse: a future war against Germany in Europe, while simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific. To avoid such a nightmare, Britain accepts compromise. French Prime Minister Pierre Laval is furious. Benito Mussolini draws his own conclusion: Britain and France are weak, and weakness invites aggression. That autumn, Mussolini launches the invasion he has long planned: the conquest of Ethiopia, one of the last independent states in Africa. Ethiopia stands in the way of Mussolini's dream of rebuilding a modern Roman Empire. Despite his public confidence, Mussolini fears international intervention, but he gambles that the League of Nations will condemn Italy loudly while ultimately doing nothing. And once again, he is correct. The League declares Italy the aggressor and imposes economic sanctions. For the first time in history, the international community attempts collective punishment to stop a war. But the sanctions are deeply flawed. The United States, Germany, and Japan are not members of the League and are not required to participate. Most importantly, oil is excluded from the sanctions. Several League members ignore them entirely. The economic damage to Italy is minimal. The League of Nations and the very idea of collective security suffers another devastating humiliation. In Berlin, Hitler watches carefully. The collapse of the Stresa Front and the League's weakness confirm what he increasingly believes: the Western democracies lack the will to resist. In September, the Nazi regime introduces 2 new laws: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for Protection of German Blood and Honor. Together, These become known as the Nuremberg Laws. They legally transform Nazi racial ideology into state policy. Germany's Jews are stripped of citizenship and political rights. Marriage and sexual relations between Jews and so-called Aryan Germans are banned. Discrimination is now not only tolerated by the state, it is enforced by law. 1935 becomes a year in which Nazi Germany grows steadily more confident. Every aggressive move triggers alarm across Europe, yet no united response emerges. Hitler recognizes the opportunity, and he decides to push further. While Germany, Italy, and Japan move toward empire, the world's greatest empire, Britain, struggles to maintain control over its own territories. In Palestine, ruled by Britain under a League of Nations mandate, tensions explode into violence. Arab opposition to British rule and increasing Jewish immigration sparks a general strike and armed revolt. Over the next 3 years, thousands will die in bombings, shootings, arrests, and military operations. Elsewhere, Britain faces growing unrest across its empire. In Egypt, Britain agrees to end decades of direct occupation, though it retains control over the strategically vital Suez Canal. In India, pressure for independence intensifies. The Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, demands full self-rule. Britain refuses. Mass protests continue, while tens of thousands of political prisoners fill colonial prisons. With imperial problems stretching from the Middle East to Asia, Britain desperately hopes to avoid another major European war. At the same time, relations between Britain and France continue deteriorating. The distrust is mutual, and France increasingly looks to its own defenses. After 6 years of construction, the Maginot Line becomes operational. This massive chain of fortifications stretches across France's eastern border. Protected by underground railways, artillery bunkers, and thousands of defensive positions, the French believe it will prevent another German invasion. But not everyone agrees. Some officers argue the strategy is outdated. Among them is a young officer named Charles de Gaulle, who believes France should invest in tanks and mobile warfare instead of static defenses. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin accelerates his second 5-year plan. Factories expand across the USSR. Chemical and aluminum production increases dramatically. Everything becomes subordinate to rearmament. Meanwhile, Hitler scores another major diplomatic victory. Just 1 year earlier, Italy had stood with Britain and France against German aggression. Now, after the Ethiopian crisis destroyed the Stresa front, Mussolini changes sides. On November 1st, 1936, he announces a new alliance with Germany. The Rome-Berlin Axis is born. Germany and Italy pledge cooperation against communism, support for Franco in Spain, and collaboration in future imperial expansion. In December, Britain faces a constitutional crisis of its own. King Edward VIII abdicates the throne after controversy surrounding his desire to marry an American divorcee. Privately, many British officials feel relief. Some are deeply concerned by Edward's admiration for Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, public opinion in the United States remains strongly isolationist. A survey reveals that 95% of Americans oppose involvement in another foreign war. New neutrality laws prohibit arms sales to nations at war. The trauma of World War I still shapes American thinking. Many believe the United States should never have entered that conflict at all. As a result, America, like Britain and France, remains largely passive while authoritarian powers continue gathering strength. By the late 1930s, dictatorships dominate much of Europe and Asia. In Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union, and nationalist China, powerful rulers use propaganda, secret police, censorship, and political terror to strengthen their control. And while the democracies hesitate, the world moves steadily closer to catastrophe. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more cinematic history videos covering World War II, forgotten empires, military strategy, and the events that shaped our world, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because history is not just about the past. It explains the world we live in today.